Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Africa Asia podcast discussion. So, it's been a while since we had a discussion, and even been longer since we had a guest. So, it's nice to be back. And tonight I'm joined by Debo. He is a legal practitioner in Nigeria. He will introduce himself a bit more. So, we'll be discussing about the Nigeria legal system and various issues around it. Debo, welcome, and you can introduce yourself. We get started.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Debo Haloko. I'm a legal practitioner in Nigeria. I work mainly in the field of commercial litigation and arbitration. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Mukame, for inviting me.
Okay. Thanks so much, Debo, for joining us. So, the first point that would be of interest to someone listening about a legal discussion is the legal system. What's the legal system like in Nigeria? And in this, for someone who is not a lawyer, Debo will explain a bit more of how a legal system really looks like and what the Nigeria legal system looks like. Debo?
Okay, the Nigerian legal system is based on the English common law system, obviously because of our colonial heritage, you know. So a lot of our legal principles are quite similar to what obtains in England. But it's also important to bear in mind that Nigeria is a constitutional democracy, at least on paper. So what that means is that the constitution is the supreme law of the land. Every other law, right, is subordinate to the constitution, and any law that is inconsistent with the constitution is likely to be declared null and void, to that extent. So, in view of this, in the hierarchy of laws in Nigeria, the constitution comes first, and then you have statutes passed by the National Assembly and the state houses of assembly, and then you have common law principles, which are typically based on English common law principles. There are principles of equity, and then you also have customary law. There are about 200 tribes in Nigeria, so you have principles of common of customary law across there's so many tribes in Nigeria. Uh, so in a nutshell, that is what Nigeria's legal system looks like. Because Mohammed asked me to explain what a legal system is, maybe I should take further to say that um, different countries have different systems of laws, broadly speaking. So you have the civil law system, which obtains in most of Europe outside of the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. Uh, and you'll find that in many countries across the world, due to their links to these European countries, they might also adopt legal systems which resemble those of their former colonial masters or countries that they have historical ties with. So, for example, it is likely that a lot of countries in South America will operate, a legal system which is very similar to that of Spain and Portugal. And then, you find countries like South Africa being influenced by Roman Dutch law. So, yeah, so in a nutshell, you can describe a legal system as the system of laws, the system of the jurisprudence that you're likely to find in a country, where you interact with the judiciary or the justice delivery sector in that country. So, I mean, I hope that's a good enough answer.
Yes, it is. And to also note, like for Kenya, because we were also colonized by the British, so our system is pretty much what you said, almost word for word. Like we have common law, doctrines of equity. The constitution is the supreme law of the land. It's rule of law that applies. So it's very similar, and being a common law system. And indeed, you find that most countries will inherit the colonial past looked like, or maybe people who they have very close ties to. I think the point that I would like at some point maybe to discuss in the future would be about customary law. So for Kenya, there's been a bit of progress on that because there are customary laws that were there, especially when it came to things like marriage. it is more on the social side. So there would be no like customary laws that regulate things like criminal activity. So that now criminal activity is regulated by a custom. Uh, it was
Mm.
mainly on the social side of things, like marriages, inheritance, those sorts of things were more on a customary side. And now what the constitution has moved towards is saying that customary law will apply, but only to the extent that it's not inconsistent with the constitution or repugnant to justice. So there are limits, although it's not defined what it is to be repugnant to justice, or it's not defined for what it means to be unconstitutional. It's just that if someone like brought a challenge to a customary law and maybe it was contrary to like the Bill of Rights under the Constitution, then that customary law might be found to be unconstitutional. But I think we can have a discussion about that because someone has previously hinted in this podcast that they think that customary law should have an upper hand over the constitution and these sort of things. I don't know, Deb, what your thoughts are on that, but also as you go to the next point, possibly about the legal profession in Nigeria, and like how many people, like compared to the Nigerian population, are within like the legal profession, and how is the legal profession like in Nigeria?
Okay. Do you want me to answer the question about the customary law points you made,
Yes,
or
yes,
should I just?
yes, yes,
Sorry.
please. Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting point. If someone feels that customary law should even trump the maybe common law system and all of that, I understand where someone who holds that kind of view might be coming from. There's this idea that the profession and the judiciary in Nigeria, and indeed, much of Africa, are colonial establishments. So, whether in Kenya, Botswana, Nigeria, in countries that inherited the British system, it almost feels like you are operating a foreign system, right? And before colonialism, so before the invasion of Lagos, before British rule was officially established in Nigeria in the 1860s, there was a system of laws applicable among the different communities in Nigeria. In fact, in the old Western region, in the Oyo Empire, they had their system of checks and balances. Even though that region was governed by monarchs, I mean, the old Oyo Empire was governed by monarchs, they had a system of holding such monarchs to account. They tried to prevent such monarchs from being authoritarians. So there are those who will argue that African law is not primitive, right? And if African law is not primitive, if we have a sensible way of regulating conduct in human society, even before the British came, why should we continue to maintain a colonial system that was handed down to us? But again, you have to also recognize that the society of today is a very different one from that of the 18th or 19th century. And a lot of the principles of law that the traditional institutions in Africa, in the African communities, operated are unsuitable for today's purposes. Now, I know I might get into trouble for saying that, but I struggle to think about how you could, for instance, apply customary law principles to certain kinds of transactions. Given that customary law in itself, and in that stage, I mean, at that stage of our development, did not anticipate those kind of transactions. So,
Mm-hmm.
in essence, we are going to have to be formulating entirely new principles of law. And in reality, that is what happens where the parliaments of the different African countries enact statutes. So apart from common law, right? In fact, in the hierarchy of laws, before you come to English common law, statutes will probably take precedence in most African common law jurisdictions. So where there's a clear provision of statute on a particular point, then the principles of case law will have to bow or succumb to that. So to the extent that we now have a different kind of organization within society by which we enact laws to regulate our conduct, uh, I one may struggle to see the purpose that customary law is going to serve, generally speaking. again, given the fact that I don't know how it is in Kenya, but in Nigeria, uh, there's the idea of personal law, right? The law applicable to you as a person, right? So I, for example, except I probably enter into a marriage clearly under customary law, right? I cannot be governed by customary law. And marriage is also one of the indicators. There are several other indicators for deciding who somebody's personal law is, for purposes of private national law. So the point I was trying to make with that is that there are a lot of people who would rather not have their affairs governed by the principles of customary law. So that is another challenge that you're going to face with that. So, but I think it is sufficient that because law is dynamic, the different African countries have statutes. I mean, have parliaments that enact statutes, you know, progressively to regulate their conduct. So, for example, in Nigeria, up until recently, the tax statutes were quite old, but you realize that of late, they've been revising the tax statute. And I mean, that's obviously because of the revenue drive of the government. We were discussing before we officially started the podcast that the country is on the verge of bankruptcy. And so there's this crazy revenue drive right now. And they've been enacting, tax statutes towards that end. So you find that Parliament has been enacting tax statutes in recent times and progressively. So there was a Finance Act of 2019, I think, or 2020, and there was another one in 2021. So to the extent that you have lawmakers who are alive to their responsibility to make sure that um, our laws are not obsolete, or that the past laws are up to date, that can sensibly regulate human conduct. I think that the existence of customary law, right, will probably not be popular enough to lead to a demand by the majority of people, for that system of laws, to apply to their daily lives. Because at the end of the day, in a democracy, it is what the majority wants, that counts. So if the majority prefer the current setup, where you have the constitution, which also should be amended from time to time anyway. You have the constitution, you have federal, in a country like Nigeria that operates a federal system, you have federal and state statutes, and then you have principles of common law, which we consider sensible enough, to govern certain kinds of transactions where there are no clear statutes. And then you then have customary law for those who want to be bound by customary law, right? So yeah, so I think at the end of the day, I think it boils down to what the majority of the people want and what is sophisticated enough, to govern human conduct, in the different aspects of life.
Deborah, I agree with what you say, especially I think it's the perspective, not looking at it as if common law or laws that came through like the colonial system, as if what we're saying is that they are better laws than the customary laws. Possibly it's just that as times go, as the nature of transactions change, as you move maybe from to like the digital economy, you need laws to be updated, like new rules about data protection or rules about, like taxing the digital economy. I think is as the world progresses, there's need to almost like for the law to keep up with that system. And if you ask me, especially on like the digital side, the law is not able to keep up as is right now because uh, there's a lot of innovations coming up, like just when you think you've had it, you hear there are different kinds of cryptocurrencies, for instance. You wonder how do you regulate it. Just when you think that you're regulating the banking sector, something else comes up, a new innovation of, like trading forex online, and things just keep, like evolving and evolving. So I think it's not that, it's just that the laws have to keep up with also like the human innovation and the human needs of the society as you're dealing with right now, which may not be like what was needed like in maybe several centuries back. But Debo, now turning on to the question about like the legal profession in Nigeria, if you could speak a bit about that.
Okay, the legal profession in Nigeria has roughly somewhere between 60 to 100,000 lawyers. On the average, there are about 5,000 lawyers admitted to the bar every year. And then there are those funny years where you have like two sets of legal practitioners admitted to the bar. So you could have up to 8,000 to 10,000 lawyers being admitted to the bar in a given year. Ordinarily, in a country of 200 million people, that's not too much, right? But in a country with an economy of our size, I think we have more lawyers than we need, in Nigeria. So yeah, like if you ask me, Nigeria doesn't have a shortage of lawyers at all. So if Nigeria was ever become a prosperous country, the legal profession will probably not be on the set of critical list of critical skills, as you usually find in those developed countries. So yeah, we have quite a number of layers in Nigeria, and then we also have a system. We also maintain the silk system in Nigeria. We have the outer bar and the inner bar. Again, that is a colonial heritage. So when the institution, and I'm not quite sure when the first set of Queen's Counsel in Nigeria were admitted to the inner bar, but I know that before independence, we had Queen's Counsel like F.R. Williams, H.O. Davies, practicing as Queen's Counsel at the Nigerian bar, even before independence. Somewhere around 1963, after we became a republic, I know that they abolished um, the silk system and they then reintroduced it in 1975. And because by now we had long gained our independence, at least we had been independent for about, or we had been a republic for about 12 years or so, it wasn't called Queen's Counsel anymore. So they decided to give it a new name, and then they named it Senior Advocate of Nigeria, which is the equivalent of Queen's Counsel in England. In fact, for a very long time, um, Nigerian lawyers in England who took silk in England were automatically admitted to the inner bar in Nigeria. So if you were a Nigerian lawyer practicing in the UK and you became a Queen's Counsel in the UK, that automatically qualified you to become a senior advocate of Nigeria. But I think I'm not sure they still have that system in place. So that just lets you know the nexus, between the rank of the senior advocate of Nigeria and the Queen's Counsel in England. Roughly, we have roughly less than 800 Queen's Counsel, and so it seems like an exclusive club. In fact, there are less than 50 female senior advocates of Nigeria. Although in recent times they've been admitting more women, than ever before. So we hope that there's a transformation in that area because I feel like from my time at the Nigerian law school, there were roughly more women than men, who were admitted to the Nigerian bar, even in my own set. So, I hope that the demographics actually begin to reflect, the proportion of women and indeed excellent women practicing at the Nigerian bar. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I think to give a comment here about Kenya again, this is very interesting for me because I'm an advocate in Kenya. So when I was admitted to the bar, so in Kenya you have to you go through law school, then you have to go to the school of law, then you have to do go through advocates training, then you're admitted to the bar of advocates. And when I was admitted to the bar, which was around 2015, 2014, 15, thereabout, I was admitted as number, I think, 10,000 and something, meaning that there were a total of like less than 11,000 advocates. And that number, I remember people making fun saying those included the deceased advocates, anyone who had ever been admitted as an advocate, and their name remained on the bar. We were less than 11,000. Of course, this is like 8 years ago, so I'm sure like the numbers have increased. But I think the interesting thing that you said was that for the population, the number maybe is the number is enough. But for the size of the economy, I think that's why now you consider it. And I think if the economy is not supporting, then I think that's an issue. I would say in Kenya that lawyers are still, I think, held in some good esteem. For the economy, on the economic side, there'll be a lawyer like involved in almost every transaction. And I think because the economy is very vibrant, like it will be growing, there are new innovations happening, then I think there's always a bit of quite some legal work happening. It may not be the most high end type of legal work, but there's a bit of activity in in that area, especially on the commercial side. And of course, like on the other side of like the society, whether it's like family issues to like criminal issues, all that. So it's quite interesting a comparison. And I think speaking about like the social side of the law, Debo, if you could comment about the Nigerian people's perspective of the legal system as a way to get justice. How trusting are the people of that system? And this now speaks of like the lawyers, like how are the lawyers regarded, the judiciary, the entire system, legal system, which I think also brings in like maybe the police when it comes to like the criminal matters where they have to be like to be involved in the investigations. How comfortable or trusting are people that they can get justice through the legal system?
Very good question. Um, in my own subjective assessment, um, I must put out there that I'm only expressing an opinion. I'll rate it at 6/10 on a scale of 10, maybe six. Just above, the average score of 5/10. And I feel like I'm even being generous in putting it at that because in recent times, people have lost confidence. A lot of people have lost confidence in the establishment of the judiciary. Uh, Most people don't trust the police. In fact, the police is regarded as a criminal gang. And the NSAS protest in 2020. You remember the NSAS protest in 2020, which went global. You know, that was an outcry by the Nigerian people against injustice. That was an outcry by the Nigerian people, both the poor and the middle class. In fact, we saw a lot of middle class folks and a sprinkling of upper class folks hitting the streets to complain about police madness in Nigeria. And so, when you talk about criminal justice delivery, right, where the police plays a very critical role, they are assigned the tasks of maintaining law and order, investigating. Where you find that an establishment that is tasked with such a critical role is irredeemably rotten. Because sometimes I wonder if we can even reform the police in Nigeria, given what I've experienced, given my own real life experiences in the course of work. Like I said, I practice primarily in the field of commercial litigation. But once in a while, you find that some of your clients will come to you because they've been investigated by the police or because members of staff have been arrested by the police and you're asked, to go represent them at the police station or at the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. And you realize that in as much as you have statutes like the Administration of Criminal Justice Act, you realize that very little has changed in Nigeria. The enactment of those statutes haven't made a significant difference in the way the police operates, in the way the law enforcement agencies operate. So, in a manner of speaking, you can literally buy your way out of any police situation, except those ones that make it to the spotlight, right? So, the ones that receive coverage in the press and where they realize that all eyes are on them, they tend to behave themselves with respect to such high profile cases. But generally speaking, I always pray never to have anything to do with the Nigerian police as a citizen, right? Even as a lawyer, I'd rather not go to a police station. It's I find myself disgusted. I find myself feeling frustrated and helpless whenever I have to go and deal with those guys. So I mean, and I'm a lawyer. How much more the average citizen out there? So if you take the police as an establishment that the public should trust with the enforcement of law and order, with an objective and fair investigation of alleged offences, I'm going to rate the police below 5/10. The police is a rotten establishment that is in need of urgent reform. So, not to get carried away, with my emotions about the Nigerian police, talking about the justice delivery sector as a whole, in recent times, people have lost confidence due to a number of factors. So, first of all, you find that a number of the institutions that you have to interact with in this sector, court registry staff, the police, uh, even the judges themselves, you find that standards are falling significantly, right? So these days, there's a lot of emphasis on technical justice. Not emphasis on technical justice, but when you read the law reports, the sense you get from reading, NWLR, which is the principal law report in Nigeria, is that people we're still at that phase in our legal history where people can escape liability if they're able to bring up a technical objection, right? And ultimately, the merit of the case may not get determined because we spent about 10 to 15 years prosecuting a preliminary objection on a technical point from the High Court all the way to the Supreme Court and then back. So people get frustrated by technical justice. People get frustrated by the delay in the civil procedure process. You know, interlocutory appeals and all whatnot. On the average, it takes about maybe 3 to 5 years for a case to get determined at the high courts, and that's if interlocutory appeals are not thrown in the way, right? Uh, and then in recent times, we are beginning to see this feeling of um, weakness in the judiciary, right? So, unlike before, when we had courageous judges in Nigeria, when the average Nigerian judge was courageous, in the good old days, some judges would prefer certain cases not to be assigned to their courts because they simply can't handle the pressure that comes with certain kinds of cases, right? Uh, and then we also find that judges are not as sober as they used to be, right? So you find a situation where, there was a very interesting case recently where a Nigerian lawyer got sentenced to prison for contempt of court. And what had happened in that case was that there was I think there was a state governor involved in the case. But I mean, I'm not quite sure of the characters involved right now. But I know that there was an important political figure involved in the case, and for some reason, this lawyer he had applied for the judge to recuse himself or herself. I think it was a female judge from the case, and she refused to do so. Now, on during one of the proceedings, there was a journalist in court who was videotaping proceedings, and this judge asked the journalist to leave the courtroom. Uh, Subsequently, she then invited two armed policemen into the courtroom. Now, there's nothing wrong with having armed policemen in the court, right? But I think those policemen were armed with assault rifles. So in Nigeria, we have policemen that we call mobile policemen, who are usually like at ready, at riot kind of police. They usually go about with AK-47s, right? So she invited, those policemen into the courtroom. Now this guy stands up and says that he was not comfortable with the presence of such heavily armed police officers in court and applied for the judge to remove those police officers from the court. And then the next thing that happened was that the judge wrote a ruling, right? In fact, according to the guy, he said he thought the judge was writing a ruling on his application for those heavily armed police officers to be removed from the courtroom. But unknown to him, what she was actually writing was his committal order, to prison for contempt. Now, apparently, what had happened, when you assess the situation, the psychological factor cannot be dispensed with. So the guy previously asked the judge to recuse herself from this case. She refused to do so. Then she had taken an issue with the journalist videotaping the proceedings. Uh, and then he then makes his application for her to remove armed policemen that she herself had invited into the courtroom in the first place, from the courtroom. And so she got aggravated and sent him to prison, without even giving him an opportunity, to make any presentation. So in essence, his right to fair hearing was denied. Even if someone is in contempt of court, right? I mean, there's contempt in the face of the court, there's contempt ex facial career. There's a procedure for dealing with contempt, right? And so that procedure was clearly not followed. So, I remember how, even in the English text, they used to say as sober as a judge, right? So, a judge is supposed to be sober, right? You're supposed to be
Mhm.
calm. Otherwise, you're going to make significant mistakes. If you allow your emotions or your um, prejudices to get in the way while you are observing. And I've seen good judges, lose their position because of some of these issues. Because there are certain lawyers who will fight, to the very end to make sure that they get some form of respite when they get wronged by those kind of judges. So I've said all of this to say that we are at a point where critical institutions involved in justice delivery require reform. And I think the most primary reform that needs to happen is, first of all, the appointment process of people who are involved in justice delivery, be it judges, magistrates, police officers. The recruitment process in the police needs to be overhauled. We need systems that entrench transparency and accountability, because I struggle to see why a judge would take issues with a journalist's video recording proceedings in courts, with the exception of secret proceedings where there's a basis to conduct proceedings in chambers. Court proceedings are going to be public, right? So I don't see any reason why a judge is going to have an issue or should have an issue with being recorded. And so you then realize that, except there is the right kind of orientation, for those who occupy some of these very delicate positions, especially judicial office, except the assistants that entrench accountability and transparency, right? We are going to keep complaining about this, the very same issues, year in, year out. And so, coupled with all these factors, I mean, when you take this factor, the fact that um, even judges are struggling with accountability and transparency, right? I mean, I go to some courtrooms and they tell you to switch off your phone, not because your phone might ring and disrupt proceedings, right? In that event, they tell people to silence their mobile phones, but they tell you to switch it off altogether, and then they then send their police orderlies to go around and make sure that your phones are actually switched off, rather than silenced, to make sure you don't disrupt the proceedings. In fact, there's a particular judge at the National Industrial Courts, right, who will tell lawyers when they come in to switch off all electronic devices. So you can't use your laptop while in court, you can't use your iPad or your tablet while in court. And I strongly believe that this judge is not particularly concerned that those devices might make noise while the court is sitting. I feel like it's more of a situation where you're trying to avoid being recorded, and maybe in future challenging the court record with your own records. So we have a situation where even judicial officers are struggling with accountability and transparency, coupled with the fact that there are also delays. We don't have enough judges. On the average, you have one judge dealing with up to 20, 30 cases in a day. So they're inundated with all these cases, delays at the Court of Appeal. I have appeals at the Court of Appeal in the Lagos Division where we are still struggling to get a hearing date for pending applications after like 2, 3 years of filing the appeals. So, we have all these issues. And as a result, the average man out there who understands all these issues knows that the Nigerian court system is not the best way to get justice, right? And the danger with that, as being a lawyer too, is that when people feel that if I come to Kenya and I get assaulted by the police, I can't go to the courts. If I come to business in Kenya and there's something goes on with the investments and I can't get justice in the Kenyan courts within 6 to 9 months, right? If you're not careful, people begin to think of other ideas, right? Taking the law into their own hands, which is very dangerous for any society. I mean, the whole essence of law is to regulate human conduct and to make sure that there's a procedure by which the people hear their grievances. And so if people don't have confidence in this procedure by which your grievances are supposed to be addressed, you then begin to devise alternative means, right? Because you've lost confidence in the police, you've lost confidence in the judiciary, and then you begin to think of other means which are not quite palatable and which can lead to a breakdown in law and order. So I feel like these issues need to be addressed, not just in Nigeria, because I've read very funny stories about other African countries as well. That we need to understand that, law is not just formality. as some people like to think. There's a reason why these rules and principles of law exist, to regulate human conduct and to make sure that society does not break down. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's the state of the legal profession in Nigeria.
Okay, that's a very good summary of it. Very interesting what you say, and there are some very similar things that happen in Nigeria as to Kenya. Especially like the police force. It even got me thinking that you see, unlike the legal profession where you're taught like the professional ethics, and where you're taught, like there's a way a lawyer should conduct themselves, there's a way an advocate of the high court should conduct themselves. You're held in high standards. I think all everyone within like the legal justice system, including the police officers, including like everyone who might be involved in that process, they must be, like trained to understand what you're saying, that it's to regulate human conduct. One, it's not to terrorize them or to stamp your authority on them, because being someone who enforces the law, you come with authority, meaning that like as a judge who can like send you to prison. A police officer comes with authority, they can lock you up. So I think it's also to know that abuse of power is also something that it should be regulated, which even lawyers, there's abuse of power by lawyers, like from taking clients money to misadvising them, and there's no recourse for them, for anyone who suffers that. But it's quite interesting. But I think it's just the justice system very similar between what happens in Nigeria and Kenya. Even I personally dread any thought of going to a police station, even for the simplest of things. Even in fact, when a police officer stops me in traffic, and they're just maybe looking at like in Kenya, you must display your insurance for your car clearly on the windscreen. Even when they stop to look at that, you panic because you're like, I may just at this point end up at the police station for some reason, because one of my tires seems a bit old. But it's that kind of terror you feel when you see a police officer. Debo, I think we can wind up the discussion if you could share any final thoughts and any like propose way forward, especially on issues of like building back the distrust that exists, yeah, with the legal system.
Okay, well, I mean, my final thoughts would just be to reiterate that there's a very urgent need for reform, across the different institutions. Not afford to have a society where people have these mindsets and, for justifiable reasons that, the courts are not the right avenue, for you to hear your grievances. People need to know that when their rights are violated or when they have a grievance, they can approach the court and that they will get justice. Not justice on paper, right? Not textbook justice, where you simply just get a judgment that you cannot enforce against the authorities. They need to be confident that when they have a judgment, from the High Court or whatever other court, that judgment carries a lot of weight and authority, and that they are going to be satisfied, that justice has indeed been done. And very instructive is also the fact that the process that it takes to eventually get to that point to where you are handed down judgments, it shouldn't take 5 to 10 years. You know, people do also need to know that I don't have to spend 5 to 10 years to have my day in court, or for the judge to tell me that, okay, yes, I was right, I've been vindicated. That process shouldn't take 10 years, right? And so there's a need to ensure that institutions of the state, the courts, the police, the different law enforcement agencies, the specialized law enforcement agencies like the Economics and Financial Crimes Commission, and all those kind of agencies are reformed to understand the need to abide by procedural rules contained in the Administration of Criminal Justice Act. And the government has to do more to provide the facilities to ensure compliance, with such statutes. So, for example, things like providing video equipment to make sure that statements are taken on camera, and the like. So, we just need to understand that, without rules, society breaks down. And it's extremely important to entrench the rule of law such that nobody feels that the best way to get justice is on the streets or by engaging an assassin or something. The mere thought of it is very terrifying. When people know that in order to settle scores, they have to go to the underworld because they feel the courts are useless. And then the judges also need to understand the critical role that they play in society. There's that principle that judges are not to be hard, right? But I feel like in this part of the world, we may have carried that principle too far. Where they say judges are not to be hard, what it means is that a judge, for example, cannot go on TV, to grant interviews about the cases before him, right? You cannot make comments to the press about the cases you're handling, or just generally appear on the press. I mean, or on TV to discuss issues, right? But in terms of ensuring that um, the institution of the judiciary is preserved as a powerful institution that regulates or acts as a check, you know, when we talk about separation of powers, the role of the judiciary in acting as a check on executive recklessness and even legislative conduct, that role is extremely important. And the judicial officers, especially the chief judges of the various states, the chief justice of Nigeria, and then the different judicial institutes have a role to play to ensure that judgments of courts are treated with sanctity. You know, there has to be a measure in place to ensure that the government does not violate court orders and judgments. So, and when the judgment of the court, for example, gets disobeyed, it is not the particular judge in question alone that should take it upon himself, to ensure that something is done about that. When the judgment of court gets disobeyed, it's an affront to the entire institution of the judiciary, and it should be treated as such. So, we need to start having these critical conversations about society. Judges need to understand the role that they play in society. They cannot simply sit back and say when they hand down a judgment, if the government complies with it, fine. If they don't, well, they're powerless, their hands are tied. They can't do anything. A lot needs to be done to ensure that Nigeria does not go the way of Somalia. And the only way we can ensure that is to make sure that laws are upheld and enforced, and that people have confidence in the institutions that have been created by law to ensure that justice is served. So yeah, I think those are my thoughts.
Okay,
Those are my
okay.
final thoughts.
Okay, thanks a lot, Debo. This has been a very interesting discussion. A lot of things to think about. I hope our listeners, once you get around to listening to this, you have some questions or some thoughts that you'd like to share. You can leave them on our social media pages, Africa iShare. But for tonight, goodbye from us, and we'll look forward to having another discussion with Debo a bit more on some of the things that have come up in this discussion. For now, it's goodbye from us.